This is A World History of Christianity, Chapter 2, 150 through 550, Adrian Hastings. The Second and Third Centuries. In July of the year 180, a number of very insignificant people, led by a man named Spiritus, coming from the small, now unidentifiable townlet of Cilium, were brought before the proconsul Saturninus in Carthage and charged with the practice of an illicit religion. The proconsul was reluctant to order their execution and begged them to return to a right mind, or at least think it over for 30 days, but they remained adamant in adherence to, quote, the religious rites of the Christians, unquote. They insisted that they lived in the most moral way, abhorred murder, theft, and bearing false witness. They willingly paid tax, but absolutely refused to do as the proconsul required and swear by the genius of our Lord the Emperor, because they did not recognize the Emperor of this world, but served instead the God whom no man has seen nor can see. Such are the simple words of Spiritus. Donata, one of his companions, added, "Give honor to Caesar as unto Caesar, but fear to God," while Secunda remarked that, "I wish to be none other than I am." Spiritus had brought with him a bag containing the letters of St. Paul, in case perhaps they might need to refer to them, but there was no need. As they persisted in their obduracy, Saturninus read out a sentence of execution, and the 12 of them, 7 men and 5 women, were immediately beheaded. They concluded the undoubtedly authentic account of their martyrdom with the Father and Son and Holy Spirit. It may seem surprising that already in the year 180 one could find a little group of highly committed Christians in some obscure corner of North Africa. Our text demonstrates how fast this new religion was spreading across the Roman world, and in fact, already beyond it. 70 years later, there were more than 130 North African bishops, each presiding over a separate church, sometimes hardly 10 miles apart. Their congregations may well have been small enough, but the figure still suggests how Christianity had spread out from the large towns to many quite insignificant places. It is right to assert that it was still an urban rather than a rural religion, urban and literate, but its attraction was less to the kind of upper urban class present mostly in the large cities and more to the lower orders, craftsmen and shopkeepers, who will have been little different in Carthage or in Cilium. While few of these people were slaves, they were certainly of no great worldly importance. The responses of the Cilian martyrs show too what sort of a religion theirs was. An intensely monotheistic and moral commitment with a very strong belief in the next life and an absolute refusal to compromise with the powers of this world. They had, too, Paul's letters with them, already translated into Latin. In an uncomplicated way, it was then a bookish religion, but not a very ritualistic one. In defending themselves, they speak about their morals, not about their rites. Undoubtedly, these people had been baptized and met regularly to celebrate the Lord's Supper, their single, regular ritual. Beyond that, it was a matter of spiritual conviction and moral imperative, grounded in an unambiguous Trinitarian belief, the Father and Son and Holy Spirit. The picture that Pliny's letter to the Emperor Trajan already presented of Christians brought to trial before him in Bithynia around 112 CE was little different, though it indicated that there were not only Christians willing to die for their beliefs, but others willing to deny them or to insist that they had already abandoned them years before. The 100% commitment to martyrdom of the Scythians would certainly not prove to be the norm in coming persecutions. We may compare this evidence, a text of a rather different sort, but much the same date, the anonymous Epistle to Diognetus. Christians are not distinguished from the rest of mankind by country, or by speech, or by dress, for they do not dwell in cities of their own, or use a different language, or practice a peculiar life, but while they dwell in Greek or barbarian cities, according as each man's lot has been cast, and follow the customs of the land in clothing and food and other matters of daily life, yet the condition of citizenship which they exhibit is wonderful and admittedly strange. Every foreign land is to them a fatherland, and every fatherland a foreign land. They marry like the rest of the world, they breed children, but they do not cast their offspring adrift. They exist in the flesh, but they live not after the flesh. They spend their existence upon earth, but their citizenship is in heaven. They obey the established laws, and in their own lives they surpass the laws. In a word, what the soul is in the body, Christians are in the world. 2nd century Christians were remarkably sure that theirs was a unique, divinely revealed doctrine about which no compromise was possible. They expected to be persecuted, but this did not make them cut themselves off from society around them. They were preoccupied with their personal lives, without any public ambition or desire to change the structures of society, except in regard to themselves in the fields of marital and sexual custom and business practice. Here their standards were indeed different from those of their neighbors. The abandonment of unwanted babies horrified them, as did any kind of marital irregularity. They admired virginity, which seemed already to present a form of perfection of life, but only extremists decried the goodness of marriage. We should not presume that because there were Christians in Cilium in 180, there were Christians in every such little town. For the Latin West, North Africa was already far more penetrated by Christianity than anywhere else, even Italy. We know that a couple of years before the Cillian martyrs suffered, a larger group had been executed in Lyons, and doubtless there were Christian churches in other parts of Gaul. But the Lyons group, while including Latin speakers and natives of Gaul, appears to have been predominantly Greek-speaking. In general, throughout Gaul, Spain, and Britain, the spread of Christianity was far less extensive than in North Africa, Egypt, or parts of Asia Minor. Few of the congregations which did exist were of any great size. That of Lyons may well have been among the largest in the Western Empire. There, nearly 50 people were martyred. A few reneged under threats or torture, others escaped arrest. The impression given is that there can hardly have been more than a couple of hundred in all before the persecution broke. There was, at least after the close of the Pauline era, almost no specifically missionary activity so far as we know. The Christian community had no organizing center, no missionary task force, no specially trained clergy. It spread through a network of family, friendship, business contacts, through the migrancy of its members, at times through the scattering effect of persecution. Through the striking moral example its members offered, especially when persecuted, and through the impact of its rapidly increasing body of literature. Judaism had already proved attractive to many non-Jews on account of its combination of clear monotheistic doctrine, moral integrity, and a remarkable body of scriptures. But Judaism was unattractive too through the necessity of circumcision for males and the way in which it imposed incorporation within an ethnic tradition. Christianity took over the attractions of Judaism without these encumbrances. Its stress was on universality, its direct appeal to people of every background and language to be incorporated within a single human community. Neither class nor sex held one back from this community, in which there was a strong sense of equality. It was a slave woman named Blandina who proved the real leader of the Lyons martyrs and was hailed as such in the church's reporting of the events quite uninhibitedly. She, the small, the weak, the despised, had put on Christ, the great and invincible champion, and was crowned with the crown of immortality. Most early Christians had undoubtedly been Jews, but by 180 this had changed divisively. The separation between the two communities was complete, and almost all new converts came directly from a pagan background, but also a local one. The leap had been achieved not only from a migratory Jewish environment, but also from a necessarily Greek one. It was probably a delay in accomplishing that second leap, which lies behind the impression of somewhat slight progress through the middle years of the 2nd century, while it was the achievement of localization in more and more places which made possible the much more rapid growth which seemed to be happening from around the close of the century. If there was no centralized authority, there was a very clear sense of authority, basically unitary and structured locally in a remarkably unified way. In the early subapostolic days, each church appears to have had a collegial leadership, a group of presbyters, with most probably a leader among them who was either called a bishop from the start or came to be called quite soon. The balance between the college and the single bishop will have varied slightly according to place. Almost everywhere, the movement was probably from the more collegial to the more episcopal, and it may be that in some places there was at first no one who could have been described as episcopus. In small towns like Cilium, with maybe no more than a tiny handful of faithful, it would be natural to have no episcopus, but a presbyter, depending on a larger community nearby. But we do not know. Certainly, whatever he was called, he will have been a married elderly man of known rectitude of life who supported himself. The reason for the arrival of a single bishop in each church was clear enough. The role of presiding at the Eucharist was likely to have belonged to a specific person, and as the Eucharist constituted the heart of Christian life, so its regular presider was naturally recognized as the head of the local church. However important other duties within the community might be, and there could be many in the larger congregations, this held the primacy. As the Christian movement spread, becoming rooted in an even wider area, the strain upon its unity and uniformity, given the lack of any single authority, was inevitable. What is remarkable is the degree of uniformity, in fact, maintained, despite the new situations, challenges, and ideas with which it came to be faced. The clear consciousness of belonging to a single fellowship of belief and practice remained decisive. This was achieved in various ways, and despite very considerable pressure to incorporate all sorts of additional ideas, mostly deriving from what has come to be described as Gnosticism, a dualistic mysticism claimed as providing a special additional revelation, a movement which probably derived from Egypt, but was spread elsewhere by various traveling teachers, of whom Valentinus, who arrived in Rome around 136, was the most influential. It mixed Christian ideas and vocabulary with all sorts of basically incompatible beliefs, mostly related to a rejection of the intellectual inheritance of the Jewish scriptures with their insistence upon the creation of a good world by the one God. Marcion, the son of a bishop in Pontus, developed a theology which systematically rejected everything to do with the Old Testament, and he built up quite a network of Marcionite congregations right across the Mediterranean world. Whereas Christian orthodoxy, for such it can already be called, insisted upon the identity of the Jewish God with the Father of Jesus worshipped by Christians, Gnostics proclaimed a vastly more complex theology and cosmology in which there were all sorts of intermediate beings who had created and still controlled the world, on account of whose activities the material universe could be perceived as a prison from which souls needed to escape. The similarities between the two essentially incompatible theologies were nevertheless sufficient for Christian beliefs to be reread, not too implausibly, in Gnostic terms. Throughout the 2nd century, local Christian communities were only too likely to be infiltrated by Gnostic teachers and ideas, bringing with them a multitude of additional scriptures, further, quote, Gospels and Acts, named after various apostles. What seems striking is the firmness with which they were rejected by the Christian community generally, through insistence upon the essential unity of the two covenants and the divisive authority of a limited group of writings known throughout the churches to derive from apostolic times, centered upon the 4 Gospels and the letters of Paul. We see the clearest formulation of a, quote, Catholic, unquote, anti-Gnostic position in the writings of Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyons, towards the close of the 2nd century. Irenaeus may have come from Smyrna. He had spent some years in Rome, and he wrote in Greek. He had experienced the width of the church's communion of his time as well as anyone. While he still represents Greek rather than Latin Christianity, it is symbolic that his major book, Against the Heresies, survived in full only in Latin. Irenaeus's insistence on the recognized scriptures, the authority of bishops derived directly from the apostles, and a doctrine of God at once monotheistic, Trinitarian, and incarnationalist, was in no way his invention. It was the defense of what we can call an early Catholicism, something predating the Gnostic challenge, but he was the first great theologian to set it out so systematically. Faced with this sort of response, the Gnostic movement, at least as located in part within the Christian community, seems to have faded fairly fast. There can be little doubt that the last years of the 2nd century witnessed not only a large expansion, but also a certain defining of Christianity. The 2 separate books of the New Testament were by now, apart from 1 or 2 rather marginal pieces, such as Jude, collected into a unity seen as constituting a single new set of scriptures to be put beside, but not replace, the Hebrew Old Scripture within a listed canon of inspired books. Other excellent works, such as The Shepherd of Hermas, probably the brother of a bishop of Rome, were well respected, but nevertheless not placed on the same level. Expansion brought with it the need to surmount the barrier of the Greek language. It was, of course, remarkable that the early church became so quickly a predominantly Greek-speaking community, given that Jesus may well never have spoken Greek at all. Its scriptures were written in Greek, its rituals were in Greek, its early literature was all in Greek. Thus the church in Rome undoubtedly used Greek in its liturgy for at least a century. But its replacement by Latin was inevitable if Christianity was to maintain its claim to universality. Latin had probably taken over within the African church well before it did. So in Rome, and it looks as if it was an African Pope, Victor, 189 through 198, who masterminded the switch in Rome itself. The translation of the scriptures into Latin was early and unproblematic. As it was a literary language used by Christians unfamiliar with Greek, it was simply the obvious thing to do. No one thought that the scriptures had less authority in Latin than they did in Greek, though mistranslations, once recognized, and the first translations were quite rough, needed to be put right. The same thing happened in Syriac, and just a little later for Coptic, indeed into more than one form of Coptic. This is particularly significant because Coptic was not hitherto a language much used for literary purposes. By the middle of the 4th century, the scriptures were also being translated into Gothic, then Armenian, and by the 5th century, Ethiopic, and then Georgian. This impressive series of translations can produce no greater surprise once the Christian sense of universality is recognized. That sense stressed in the Epistle to Diognetus of being at home in any language and culture. The privileging of Greek as Christianity's sacred or original language came later. First, with Byzantine clerics from the late 4th century, who increasingly identified the church with the empire centered in Constantinople. Secondly, with post-Renaissance biblical scholars preoccupied with the original text of the New Testament to an extent far beyond the concern of the early or medieval church. Thirdly, with modern theorists of religion anxious to provide every religion with a sacred language. Christianity had none. If Irenaeus appealed to a canon of scripture and defended the goodness of created matter, especially the flesh with which the Son of God had assumed, he also insisted upon the authority of the episcopate as interpreter of correct teaching, an authority derived person to person from the apostles. Anyone who wishes to discern the truth may see in every church in the whole world the apostolic succession clear and manifest. We can enumerate those who were appointed as bishops in the churches by the apostles and their successors to our own day. This sounds a large claim, and many historians have questioned its plausibility. But there is really no compelling reason to deny the core of it, or to doubt that Irenaeus, who had known Polycarp in his youth, as Polycarp had known John, had adequate ground for what he said. What matters to us is anyway that by the late 2nd century, this is how it could be conceived. In the principal cities where the apostles had worked, they had appointed bishops, and more bishops had been appointed as the churches multiplied in places where the apostles had never been, but all could be included within a framework of apostolic authority. There was, however, no clearly formulated way of relating these bishops to one another. Each was thought to preside in his own church with apostolic authority. In practice, most of them were simple, poorly informed ministers who could not conceivably have coped with a theological conundrum with the insight of an Irenaeus. What happened in consequence was that they consulted with one another and met in local synods, first informal, then formal. By the middle of the 3rd century, this was happening on a large scale. We know of major episcopal gatherings at both Carthage and Rome in 251, at Carthage again in 256, and at Antioch in 268, among others. At such meetings, called undoubtedly by the bishop of the see where the meeting was held, most of the rest said little or nothing. In practice, a sharp distinction was developing between the bishops of a small number of major cities, who were backed by a numerous clergy of their own, and other bishops belonging to small towns in their neighborhood, who mostly did as they were told. The authority of the major sees was based on the size and wealth of their church, the theological and administrative expertise they had at hand, and the civil importance of their cities within the imperial order. Nevertheless, they sought as well specific ecclesiastical justification and tried to find it in a claim to apostolic foundation. Unfortunately, the evidence for this was mostly none too good. Alexandria could only lay claim, somewhat dubiously, to St. Mark. Antioch admittedly had been visited by both Peter and Paul, but they had moved on elsewhere, so that Antioch lacked the prestige of an apostle's grave to guarantee a sort of continued presence. Carthage had nothing at all. Jerusalem, which had the incontestable authority of James, the Lord's brother, had been so disrupted by the Roman destruction and subsequent rebuilding as a Greek city that its ecclesiastical authority had been considerably diminished. Ephesus probably had John, though this honor was disputed by other churches. Corinth, Athens, and other Greek cities were all proud to have been preached to by Paul. But it is clear that in reality, the emerging regional primacy of a few churches by the 3rd century had little to do with the apostles, and much with the combination of secular importance and the contemporary strength of their Christian community. Alexandria, Antioch, Carthage, and Athens, and Rome stood head and shoulders above anywhere else. And apart from Irenaeus, all the Christian writers of significance in this period were connected with one or other of these 5 churches. However, in apostolic terms, Rome remained in a class of its own because it did possess the burial place of both the principal apostles of the Gentile world, Peter and Paul. It could claim in consequence to be an apostolic see in a way that none of its potential rivals could plausibly imitate. And it did so. It was probably Pope Anicetus, 155 through 166, who erected a noted memorial shrine for St. Peter on the Vatican Hill at the place of his burial about 164, maybe precisely the centenary of his death. With the emphatic gospel promises to St. Peter of texts like Matthew 16:18, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church." It is hardly surprising that the bishops of Rome came to stress that their succession derived especially from him, and that this gave them a uniquely extensive authority. The way Irenaeus put it may represent a common 2nd century perspective. Quote, "It would be very long in a book of this kind to enumerate the successions of all the churches." Unquote. Hence, it is sufficient to refer to that in the greatest, most ancient, and well-known church, founded and established by the most glorious apostles, Peter and Paul, in Rome, for to this church, on account of her more powerful principality, it is necessary that every church should agree or come together. Few non-biblical texts have been so argued over as this one. But it should be obvious enough that in apostolic terms, the Church of Rome had no rival, bar Jerusalem, and Jerusalem's church, with its strongly Jewish Christian character, had been marginalized and effectively cut off from developing by political and military history. Irenaeus could already point to the way Clement of Rome in the late 1st century had intervened when there was a conflict within the Church of Corinth. Rome was not only, however, an apostolic church, par excellence, it was also the church of the imperial capital. That did not make its life any easier. Indeed, it bore the brunt of more frequent persecution than anywhere else. Moreover, there was no necessity for Christians to acknowledge some sort of centrality for the church where the empire was centered. On the contrary, as the empire was often viewed as Babylon, a sink of worldly iniquity, a highly otherworldly religion might be expected to want little to do with it. All the same, in periods of peace, it was natural enough that the Church of the Capital should take the lead in all sorts of things, and that Christians from elsewhere, Gnostics and heretics included, should turn up in Rome far more than they did in any other city. Given the size of the population of Rome, it is not surprising that its church should have grown so much in numbers and should have acquired a fair amount of property. The digging of its catacombs for burial was a considerable enterprise in itself. About the year 250, its bishop had beneath him 40 presbyters, 7 deacons, 7 subdeacons, 42 acolytes, 52 exorcists, readers, and doorkeepers, and over 1,500 widows and others in distress for whom it provided relief. The 7 deacons and subdeacons were responsible for organizing the 7 ecclesiastical districts into which Pope Fabian, 236 to 250, divided the city. These figures are not huge. Nevertheless, the Roman Church clearly had staff and resources well beyond those of most other places, especially in the West. Little by little, one can see out of all this the papacy emerging, exercising an undefined but incontestable role, one recognized to some extent throughout the Christian world. There was at this time still no question of any conscious division between East and West, Greek and Latin, in the Church any more than in the Empire, to separate Rome from the East. If its own liturgy was now principally in Latin, it certainly continued to be open to numerous Christians from the eastern parts of the Empire who gravitated to the capital, and several 3rd century popes, Antiochus, Sixtus II, and Dionysius, were Greeks. One thing in which Rome certainly did not excel was the writing of theology. Among Latin writers, those of Carthage, Tertullian, and Cyprian were more powerful thinkers than anyone connected with Rome, but the most creative center of Christian theology was undoubtedly Alexandria. Here, the intellectual tradition of the large Jewish community had been taken over, and, stimulated by the challenge of Gnosticism, 2 remarkable theologians, Clement, circa 150 to 215, and Origen, circa 185 through 254, developed a systematic and subtle approach, both to the interpretation of Scripture and to the relation of Christian belief and its formulation to the current philosophy of the secular world, far beyond anything else achieved in this period. It is to be noted, too, that, though Christians formed a quite small proportion of the total population, their literature in the 2nd and 3rd centuries was already far more impressive in vigor of thought, imaginativeness, and diversity than that of anyone else. There were 2 short but sharp periods of persecution in the middle of the 3rd century. One under the Emperor Decius around the year 250, in which the bishops of Rome, Jerusalem, and Antioch were all martyred, and another enforced particularly in Africa under Valerian in 258, of which Cyprian of Carthage was the most prominent victim. For most of the century, however, Christians were allowed to exist in peace, and the churches to own property, enter into negotiation with the civil authorities where they needed to, and grow steadily in numbers. It is hard to say quite how numerous Christians were by the close of the 3rd century, and it is easy to exaggerate their proportion within the general population. Perhaps in a few areas they could have exceeded 20%, even more in certain towns in Egypt and Asia Minor. But in general, the figure must be lower, and in most of the West, far lower, less than 10%. Nevertheless, there was no other remotely comparable religious or civil body. Christians formed a well-organized, self-aware community. They appeared to be represented virtually everywhere. They had even begun openly building churches, including a cathedral in the eastern imperial capital of Nicomedia, instead of, as earlier, simply worshiping within private houses. They included a few members of the wealthy, even senatorial class, mostly women. They appeared to have built up a coherent intellectual and literary system of their own, and most serious of all, they appealed confidently and directly to divine authority, which they unquestioningly put above that of the emperor. It held them back from military service and much else. It is not surprising that again and again emperors had concluded that this was something which could not be tolerated, an empire within the empire, and that as Christians became ever more confident and numerous, an imperial decision was taken that at whatever cost it was necessary to crush them. The great persecution was the result. It is linked with the Emperor Diocletian, 285 to 305, though it actually began only in 303 and was probably chiefly the responsibility of his deputy and successor, Galerius. Diocletian's original aim was the destruction of an institution, not the killing of people. He was well aware of the counterproductive consequences of martyrdom, but it proved impossible to separate the two. The churches went up in flames, all sacred books were to be handed over and destroyed, church services were forbidden, but there was at first no insistence that Christians should be compelled to sacrifice to the gods. In some places the authorities did not look too closely at what books were actually surrendered, perhaps just heretical ones or even a medical textbook. Most Christians and many of the clergy hoped to avoid the disobedience which would lead to execution, but others were wholly uncompromising. Anyone handing over anything was for them a traitor. Pope Marcellinus in Rome was one such traditor. At Abitina in Africa, the bishop too had handed over the scriptures, but his congregation rebelled and continued to worship in the house of a lector named Emeritus. The authorities eventually struck. 47 Christians were arrested and imprisoned in Carthage, including their presbyter, Saturninus, and his 4 children. In prison before execution, the Christians of Abitina emphatically condemned any traditor. To hand over the scriptures to be burned was to merit eternal damnation. This divide between the compromisers and the uncompromising was soon to tear the church apart, but also to force systematic reconsideration of the handling of both sin and sinners. After the death of Diocletian, the persecution quickly died down in the west, but in the east it was renewed by Galerius and his deputy Maximin Dia, with ever-increasing violence. Everyone was ordered to sacrifice to the gods, and the names of those who did so were checked by the military against taxation rolls. Punishments grew worse and worse. In Egypt especially, whole villages were massacred. Yet it was clearly not succeeding. There were too many martyrs and too much sympathy for them. In the ceaseless jockeying for power between emperors in East and West, the absence of persecution in the latter and the bitterness it was producing in the former could only strengthen the hands of the tolerant. Egypt was being alienated and on the verge of rebellion, while Christian writers like Eusebius of Caesarea were winning the propaganda war. In 311, about to die, Galerius called it all off. The degree in which he did so is revealing. All that he had done, he claimed, was for the advantage of the state and to bring Christians back to common sense, so that they would stop making laws for themselves and in assembling in different places people of different nationalities. It was recognition that Christianity had developed into a kind of alternative state of universalist dimensions which seemed so threatening. But, Galerius continued, seeing that, in their obstinacy, they had mostly failed to return to the worship of the gods, and were now in consequence worshipping no one, he had decided to exercise indulgence and allow them to reestablish their churches once more. Constantine and an imperial church. The very extent and purposefulness of the great persecution underlined the significance of its failure. The Christian church was now a power in the empire, not because it used force, but because it did not. And yet, despite the inevitable compromises of many of its members when faced with a threat of execution or deportation to the mines, it held the minds and hearts of a large proportion of the population in a way that nothing else did. But what if military force and Christian faith could only be united? Would that not create a new and glorious empire? At some point, it was impossible to know just when. This became the conviction of the young Caesar in the northwest. Constantine, son of the former emperor Constantius, and his first wife, Helena, who had herself become a Christian. He had been proclaimed emperor at York by the legions stationed there on his father's death in 306, but he had the advantage of being brought up in Diocletian's court at Nicomedia. So he knew the eastern situation well enough, even though his power base was in the less Christianized west. When Constantine marched south from Gaul to defeat his western rival, Maxentius, he claimed to have seen a heavenly vision promising him victory, and he certainly had a Spanish bishop, Josias of Cordoba, among his advisors. From the time that he won the battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 and occupied Rome, he was already publicly identified with the Christian cause, although he did not, to begin with, wholly distance himself from other cults. The last pagan symbols disappear from the coinage only in 323. The so-called Edict of Milan of 313 agreed with the new Eastern Emperor Licinius, simply decreed that every man may have complete toleration in the practice of whatever worship he has chosen, an admirable principle which Constantine's Christian successors would quickly abandon. His patronage of the church, together with personal interference in its affairs, grew and grew until his baptism on the eve of death in 337. The rapidity of the change in Christianity's public status must have been extremely hard for both Christians and pagans to relate to. Property and exemptions from tax were rained on the clergy. The gift of the Lateran Palace in 313 remains especially symbolic. It had been the property of Constantine's wife, Fausta, but now became and remained for centuries the Pope's principal residence. In it, medieval councils were regularly held. From then on, the Bishop of Rome would have two homes, the Lateran and the Vatican, one reflecting his imperial inheritance, the other his apostolic one. Few could tell which mattered more. While the famous Donation of Constantine, a document purporting to bestow upon the Pope huge ecclesiastical and political authority, is a forgery of the 8th century, though one actually inimical to the papacy's best case for primacy, The Lateran was in point of fact donation enough. It signified a massive accretion in political status, but it is not irrelevant to an understanding of its significance to remember that, if the gift was part of Constantine's power game, the later murder of Fausta, asphyxiated in her bath, was another part, just one of many political murders for which he was responsible. Constantine would later be named the 13th apostle and venerated in the Eastern Church as a saint. It was a sanctity of a rather new kind. Constantine was persuaded that he had been divinely chosen to rule the world, and that this responsibility most certainly included ensuring as well the unity and orthodoxy of the Church. Ecclesiastically, he was faced with an immediate crisis. North Africa had been the scene of the worst persecution in the West, and its termination had been followed by bitter conflict between the new bishop of Carthage, Caecilian, who took a fairly mild line in regard to those who had compromised under persecution, and opponents led by Donatus, for whom traditors were to be shunned and sacraments connected with them judged invalid. Constantine could not, he wrote to a Christian official, ignore such quarrels, lest the highest divinity may be moved to wrath, not only against the human race, but against me myself, to whose care he has by his heavenly will committed the government of all earthly things. Such was the new imperial ideology by which the Church had now to be steered. Constantine told Miltiades of Rome to resolve the matter, and when the Donatists rejected Miltiades' judgment, remitted the question to an interprovincial council held at Arles in August 314. A council which included 3 British bishops and confirmed what Miltiades had decided. Arles was important, not only as the first regional council in the West, but because its very calling demonstrated so clearly the Church's new imperial regime. It all happened so quickly that no one had time to interrogate the change which was taking place. It seemed so providential and exciting that the emperor should show such intense personal interest in ecclesiastical issues that the risks this brought could hardly be envisaged. In 324, Constantine defeated the mildly anti-Christian Licinius and united the empire firmly beneath his own by now emphatically Christian rule. In the East, as already in Africa, however, he found a church divided between Bishop Alexander of Alexandria on the one side and a priest named Arius on the other. The conflict here was about the divinity of Christ, and while Alexander enjoyed by far the greater support, it happened that the 2 Eastern bishops closest to Constantine sympathized with Arius. Eusebius, bishop of the imperial capital of Nicomedia, and the historian and apologist Eusebius of Caesarea. At once, Constantine resolved to settle the matter, and a general council of bishops was called to meet at Nicaea in May 325. Nicaea was conveniently close to his capital of Nicomedia, and when some 230 bishops arrived, he himself opened the assembly. What is really remarkable is that the Council of Nicaea came down so emphatically and almost unanimously against Arius, despite the views of the 2 Eusebiuses. If at the time Constantine acquiesced, it was partly because this was the view of his old Western advisor, Bishop Hosius, but perhaps also because, with the eye of a superb political strategist, he knew he needed Egyptian loyalty, and the Egyptian bishops were overwhelmingly behind Alexander and his brilliant deacon Athanasius. Later he would have second thoughts. Eusebius of Nicomedia became his most intimate religious confidant and the person who baptized him on his deathbed. A year later, Eusebius was promoted by Constantius to be bishop of Constantinople, a model for the new courtly ecclesiology. Athanasius, who had succeeded Alexander as bishop of Alexandria, on the other hand, was sent into exile. But the ferociously complicated ins and outs of doctrinal history in the post-Nicaea period matter less than the imperial framework which from now on so largely controlled the surface of ecclesiastical life. Only someone with the intellectual power, obstinacy of will, and longevity of Athanasius could stand against it. It is hardly surprising that Constantine should come to be venerated as the friend of God and 13th apostle. Upper-class Christians were proud of Rome, and it was not hard to see one supreme providential plan running through the course of history. Luke had taken pains to tie the life of Jesus into the reigns of Augustus and Tiberius in Luke 2:1 and 3:1, and in the Acts to carry on the story to the arrival of Paul in Rome. It was not hard to see the empire as divinely ordered to provide space for God's universal church, or to recognize that part of the plan must be the linking of the two into one, something now achieved. Eusebius of Caesarea was the principal theorist of this new imperial view of Christian history, the church's leading historical scholar, whose history of the church ends with Constantine's victory over Licinius, his praise as preeminent in every virtue that true religion can confer, and a picture of the world where everyone now danced and sang in city and country alike. In his Life of Constantine, Eusebius describes how on one occasion, amid a company of bishops, Constantine remarked, "You are bishops, whose jurisdiction is within the church. I also am a bishop, ordained by God to overlook those outside the church." He watched over all his subjects, commented Eusebius, with a truly episcopal care. Finally, when in 336 Constantine celebrated his Tricennalia, 30 years of rule, in Jerusalem, Eusebius was there once more to delineate the divine order: one God, one Word and Savior, one Emperor whose role it is to interpret to the whole human race the knowledge and love of God. Eusebius, in his oration for the Tricennalia, provided the ideal norm for church and state, which would govern Eastern Christianity for many centuries. If it was now to be an imperial church, it was also to be, far more explicitly than hitherto, a Greek church. In 330, Constantine moved from Nicomedia east of the Bosporus to dedicate his new capital of Constantinople on its western side, transforming the old Greek city of Byzantium. It was to be a thoroughly Christian capital, as Rome at that time could not possibly be. From the 3rd century, the emperors had increasingly realized that they needed for all sorts of strategic reasons to be based well to the east of Rome, but they had never made of their various working capitals a new Rome, in the way that Constantine now did. For almost all of them, however, Old Rome was an unattractive place, too aristocratically conservative, too dominated by the great senatorial families, to allow a somewhat parvenu emperor to feel quite at home. On the Bosporus they could do so, For Constantine, the revulsion from Rome was above all religious. It remained too pagan a city. However much property he might bestow on its bishop, that could not alter its real character, and Constantine wanted something very different. Rome was left to the Senate and its old gods, but Constantinople would become the true center of the new political and ecclesiastical order. Nova Rome, the capital of a new Roman people, a Christian people. While at first its diocese was subordinate to that of Heraclea, inevitably it quickly came to be recognized as a see equal at least to Alexandria and Antioch. In 381, the third canon of the Council of Constantinople decreed that the Bishop of Constantinople shall have the privileges of honor after the Bishop of Rome, because it is New Rome. It was in other ways an important and reconciling council, bringing the long Arian dispute to a close. But this canon was declaring something quite new and inevitably controversial. It is not surprising that the following year a council held in Rome insisted that the Holy Roman Church has been set before the rest by no conciliar decrees, but has obtained the primacy by the voice of our Lord and Savior. Thou art Peter. The second see was consecrated at Alexandria, the third see at Antioch. It is significant that when the year before the Council of Constantinople, the Emperor Theodosius declared Christianity the empire's official religion, the latter had been defined in terms of the doctrine taught by the bishops of Rome and Alexandria, with no mention of Constantinople. The ecclesiastical conflicts of the 4th and 5th centuries were, in point of fact, to a large extent due to the attempts of the Church of Alexandria to prevent Constantinople from ousting it in the pecking order of episcopal power. In the 70 years following the Council of Constantinople, the Bishop of Alexandria contrived the deposition of the Bishop of Constantinople no fewer than 3 times. In the short run, the bishops of Constantinople, whatever privileges of honor were accorded them, were peculiarly vulnerable to the pressures of the court, the Constantinopolitan populace, and the rest of the empire. Until a later period, they lacked the backing which Alexandria, Antioch, and Rome possessed of a secure local tradition. But this was not just a matter of rivalry between 2 sees or 2 theologies. The continual aggrandizement of the See of Constantinople was an inevitable part of the way the empire was going. It would provide a norm for Christianity of a specifically Greek sort. By the 6th century, the Bishop of Constantinople would have assumed the title of Ecumenical Patriarch. With that title, there was no longer a question of claiming an equality of the 5 patriarchates of Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Constantinople, a slightly earlier Eastern view of how the world church's government should be shaped. Instead, the logic of Constantinian Christianity, in which one empire was seen as providentially renewed in Christian form and focused upon the new Rome on the Bosporus, was bound to lead to the concept that here and here alone was a truly universal patriarchate. This ecclesiological development could only mature, nevertheless, little by little. What happened much more quickly in the wake of Constantine's original revolution was a vast public Christianization of society. The numbers poured in. The majority of senior people in power were soon at least nominal Christians. Bishops everywhere became figures of importance in society, and large churches were erected at public expense in all the main cities of the empire. It was no longer thought improper except by the more austere, for a Christian to take arms and be a soldier. Already in 321, Sunday was declared a public holiday. People began to go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem, following Helena, Constantine's mother, who founded basilicas on the Mount of Olives and in Bethlehem. Even in provinces like Britain, where Christianity was a somewhat late arrival, and there was only a handful of dioceses, it was penetrating into the countryside and accepted by wealthy landowners, while in North Africa or Lower Egypt, the rural population was by the late 4th century overwhelmingly Christian. In 360, Julian became emperor on the death of his cousin Constantius II. A successful general, he had been given the rank of Caesar by Constantius and named as his successor. A brilliant philosopher king who had been brought up a nominal Christian, but had come to hate Christianity and the regime which had murdered his father, a half-brother of Constantine, and so many of his family. He set himself to restore Hellenic civilization and the worship of the gods. Christian privileges were withdrawn, religious freedom granted to every dissident group on the assumption that if left free to do so, Christians would quickly tear themselves to pieces in their deadly hatred of one another. As Ammianus Marcellinus, a contemporary pagan chronicler, bitingly reported. Temple worship was to be restored, and Julian himself spent his time sacrificing to one god or another, while attempting to persuade non-Christians to pull themselves together and even adopt a religious organization and practice of charity modeled on the Christian. Why do we not observe, he complained, that it is their benevolence to strangers, their care for the graves of the dead, and the pretended holiness of their lives that have done most to increase atheism, i.e. Christianity. He offered instead a mix of Neoplatonism, classical literary culture, a Mithraistic worship of the sun, and a general revival of all local cults, as of the traditional gods of the Greeks. Such a program appealed to plenty of upper-class people for whom attachment to Christianity had been little more than a matter of political convenience. But it was intensely artificial. The religious revolution had gone too far to be turned back, even by a highly imaginative emperor. He tried, moreover, to do everything at once, marched into Persia, and despite initial military success, was defeated and killed less than 2 years after coming to power. It is striking that absolutely no one attempted to maintain Julian's policy after his death. Christian political control was immediately resumed. There was no alternative group of people capable of leading society. If one considers the leading figures of late 4th century Christianity, Athanasius, Basil, John Chrysostom in the East, Ambrose, Hilary of Poitiers, and Martin in the West, one is looking at an exceptional group of people, in both intelligence and moral commitment, who were carrying across a great deal of the culture of Athens and Rome in the revolutionary construction of a new socio-religious order. There was simply no one to rival them upon the other side, except for Julian himself, and he was too idiosyncratic to be convincing. While conversion to Christianity in the post-Constantinian world was undoubtedly for many people a matter largely of political convenience, it was also for a dynamic minority a matter of philosophical and moral conviction. This was a generation still on the frontier between two vast religious views, but that frontier could certainly not be divisively crossed or recrossed simply by the power of the state. When Julian died in Persia, his troops elected a Christian general, Jovian, to replace him, and within 3 months, Athanasius was riding into Antioch in triumph with the new emperor. Ambrose represents the new Christian establishment at its most decisive. The son of the Praetorian prefect of Gaul, he was the governor of Aemilia and Liturgia, with his base in Milan, when in 370 the Christians of Milan were contentiously seeking a new bishop. As a conscientious governor, he had intervened in an attempt to keep the meeting calm when suddenly his own name was proposed. The idea proved irresistible, though he was at the time unbaptized. Within a week, baptism and episcopal consecration had followed. Milan was at the time the Western imperial capital, and Ambrose's public role was enormous, his political experience reinforcing his episcopal prestige. He forced Theodosius to do penance after his appalling massacre at Thessalonica in 390, but he prevented him from restoring a synagogue burnt down by Christians at Callinicum 2 years earlier. The new Christianity was already becoming alarmingly intolerant, and this was particularly noticeable in regard to the Jews, whom the pagan empire had treated far more kindly than it had treated Christians. Theodosius produced laws against Manichaeans, Apollinarians, and Arians, among others. In 380, he formally declared Christianity the official religion of his empire, but the most irreversible step was probably that of 391, forbidding the celebration of pagan sacrifices. Constantine's age of religious tolerance, far from complete but still basically genuine as between Christians and non-Christians, was now replaced by one of ecclesiastical establishment and the official exclusion of alternatives, other than a tolerated Judaism. The closure of the temples, or their wholesale transformation into Christian churches, began the age of a permanently persecuting church, though doubtless in practice in many more remote areas, that was still far from the reality, and many temples continued to function well into the 5th century. In much of this, Ambrose was the guiding light, combining the confidence of a Roman ruler with Greek culture and a rather self-righteous sense of inheriting a biblical prophetic mantle. He almost always got his way. The last major intellectual battle between the old and the new religious outlooks came in 384 with the appeal to the emperor by Symmachus, the prefect of Rome, for the maintenance of the altar of victory in the Senate house. Why abandon the gods through whom Rome has won so many victories? Why cannot everyone live and believe in his own way? There cannot be only one road to so great a mystery. The arguments of Symmachus were dignified, traditional, and pluralist. But Ambrose ensured that the appeal was rejected. Ambrose's main contemporary in Rome was Damascus, 366 to 384. It was he who had appealed to him to take up the issue of the altar of victory with the Western emperor. Damascus was hardly an attractive figure. He had come to the position by disposing of his Christian opponents in a couple of very nasty massacres, one in the Julian Basilica, the other in the Liberian. He lived in a grand way, socializing rather too frequently with senatorial ladies and proving very unhelpful in regard to St. Basil's patient attempt to sort out the continuing confusion left in Antioch by the Arian conflicts. Basil finally described him as impossibly arrogant. Damascus spent his time harping on the authority of his apostolic see and his position as direct successor of St. Peter, while showing very little understanding of what was actually going on in the East. But he built churches, restored catacombs, wrote epigrams about the martyrs, and had them elegantly inscribed in marble by a friend. Moreover, he commissioned his secretary, St. Jerome, the outstanding scholar of his age, to revise the existing Latin translations of the Gospels on the basis of the Greek texts. He behaved then very much like many a later pope, and he represents the way in which the withdrawal of the emperor from Rome left room for its bishops to expand the exercise of their authority, even though for the time being that of the Bishop of Milan, where the imperial government in the West had its base, was politically more important. The monastic movement. If Damascus, Ambrose, and Theodosius provide a political face for the post-Constantinian church, which is not altogether appealing, it needs to be balanced by consideration of a very different side of 4th century Christianity, that of monasticism, the development of whole communities of people committed to a life of prayer and asceticism, including both poverty and celibacy. It was not new in principle. The admiration of virginity goes back to apostolic times, and virgins had long held a recognized position in the church. Even the new monastic movement dates from late 3rd century Egypt and probably Palestine too, well before the age of Constantine began. In this, as in much else, the new political context would hasten, rather than originate, the way things would go. A common error in church historical interpretation is to underestimate the dependence of developments in the 4th century upon what went before. It was in the 270s that Antony, about 20 years old, heard the words of the Sunday Gospel read in Coptic, "If thou wilt be perfect, go and sell all that thou hast and give to the poor, and come, follow me." But his immediate response was no different from that of many people before him. He moved to a shed on the edge of his Egyptian village, continued to share in public worship, supporting himself by making mats and baskets, and learnt from older ascetics, living in the same way. Considerably later, he moved out to the edge of the desert, developing a new model of emphatically eremitical life, a model that many others soon came to imitate, until, in Athanasius's later hyperbolic words, the desert was made a city by monks coming out from their own and enrolling themselves in the heavenly citizenship. If Antony's way remained that of a hermit, we have almost at once another dimension, some sort of communion between a network of ascetics, each living alone, but not far apart, while supporting one another spiritually and materially, probably even coming together, at least occasionally, for common prayer. Both at Nitria in Egypt and in various Palestinian sites, a pattern of monastic life was evolving, which came to be called a lavra, where a group of solitaries shared a church and a bakehouse, so that the element of community obtained institutionalized form, however limited. Total withdrawal of a hermit into the isolation of purely personal prayer was too contrary to the liturgical nature of Christianity, and too dangerous psychologically for the individual to become normative for long. But it was Pachomius, a young Egyptian ex-army conscript, who was converted to both Christianity and the monastic vocation about 313, who took the decisive step in constructing the first fully Cenobitic monastery at Taberniceus, close to the Nile in Upper Egypt. The Pachomian community was a simple, almost military institution in which hundreds of monks could be housed, educated, and disciplined. It was broken into a number of residential blocks, each for 20 to 40 monks, with a common assembly hall, refectory, kitchen, bakehouse, and guesthouse. Soon numbers required a second foundation, and then a third and a fourth, with another for women. Monasteries of this size really needed considerable resources, including the means to transport their products and buy necessities. It is not surprising that the Pacomian communities were all close to the river. There were similar developments in Palestine. Then, shortly after Antony's death in 356, his life was written by Athanasius, whose anti-Arian struggles Antony and most other monks had vigorously supported. The life of Antony quickly became something of a spiritual bestseller. In Book 8 of his Confessions, Augustine vividly describes the effect of reading it on a group of civil servants at Trier. The story was told to him by another civil servant, Pontitianus, in 386, and it had happened some time before. Everywhere, monasticism was spreading, first in the Greek world, but then also in the Latin, and that is the more interesting, given that Antony, Pachomius, and most of the early Egyptian monks, whose experience became, in a way, paradigmatic for the whole movement, spoke neither Greek nor Latin, only Coptic. But as it spread, so did it change. The figure of St. Basil the Great, circa 330 to 379, is the best signifier of what happened. A member of one of the most devout Christian families of Caesarea, Basil had St. Macrina the elder for his grandmother, St. Macrina the younger for his elder sister, and St. Gregory, bishop of Nyssa, for his younger brother. Everyone in the family was both extraordinarily good and extraordinarily well educated. After schooling at Caesarea, Basil went for further study in Constantinople and Athens before deciding to become a monk at just about the time of Antony's death. After a year or two learning how to do it in Egypt and Syria, he set up as a hermit near his hometown, but was soon involved in all sorts of theological and evangelical work until in 370 he was elected bishop of Caesarea, the same year Ambrose became bishop of Milan. But whereas the election of Ambrose was something of a miracle, Basil's represented the natural choice of a maturing church. He was one of the most balanced of Christian leaders in this formative period, the man who did more than almost anyone else to bring to a close the fearful rifts produced through the decades of Christological controversy subsequent to Nicaea, reconciling the extreme anti-Arians like Athanasius with the moderates, strong in Asia Minor, who were alarmed by the tendency of Alexandrian theology to underplay the humanity of Christ. His influence on monastic development was even more decisive. At Caesarea, he established a vast monastery which included both the episcopal residence and extensive hospitals and hostels for the poor. He also wrote a series of rules which effectively provided the shape of most subsequent monastic life in the Eastern Church. With Basil, monasticism has already proved from the isolation of the Coptic countryside to incorporation within an episcopally led urban church, where an extensive liturgical life and participation in the wider pastoral care of the community had replaced the extreme asceticism of the earliest ideal. That is not, of course, to say that after Basil, remoteness of location or the rigors of ascetic competition would be abandoned by all monks. Far from it. Simeon Stylites, the first of numerous anchorites to spend most of his life sitting on the top of a tall pillar, was born 10 years after Basil died. The Stylites flourished especially in Syria, not far from Basil's Caesarea. Monasticism took a great many different forms in its first 200 exciting years, some of them decidedly odd. What is striking is that while beginning with the most poorly educated, it could so quickly appeal to the most highly cultivated people, while becoming at the same time a mass movement. It was the multitude of monks, perhaps more than anything else, which explains why by 360 a counter-revolutionary movement of the sort Julian hoped to lead really had no chance at all. And yet, While monasticism was in its origins a withdrawal from the rather tight organizational shape of local dioceses, it was quickly harnessed to strengthen rather than divide existing church organization, and came to provide centers for religious specialization and theological learning of a sort that had not hitherto existed. It was natural for Basil to be called to the episcopate. He had every qualification of class, education, and holiness, but as a monk he represented the beginning of a new type of bishop who would profoundly alter the ethos of ecclesiastical leadership. In 372, just 2 years after Basil became a bishop, Martin, founder of the very first monastery in Gaul, was made Bishop of Tours and became a pioneer evangelist of the Gallic countryside. Although some criticized his appointment because he was grubby and lower class, he was certainly a different type from Ambrose, but Basil and Martin provided henceforth the norm for the best kind of bishop in both East and West for 800 years, someone who had first been a monk. It brought with it, among other things, a shift from the elderly married man to the younger celibate. The monastic movement can be seen as many things. On one side, it was a reaction of a traditionally ascetic religion to the wealth and worldliness inescapable in the new church order. No longer was martyrdom a likely way to heaven. Monasticism could replace it as the best exemplific road to spiritual perfection. It was equally a road back to the holy simplicity of apostolic times, the lifestyle described in the early chapters of Acts. No one claimed for his own use anything that he had, as everything they owned was held in common. Acts 4:32. In this sort of restorationism, early monasticism was very similar to many later movements in Christian history, an attempt to recreate a primitive New Testament purity. Undoubtedly, it provided a freshness of spiritual teaching and example, which, however much monks appeared to be withdrawing from the church and public life, in fact became central to the way Christianity was conceived. The serious pursuit of holiness came to be seen as requiring celibacy. In the West, Ambrose was the principal sponsor of such insistence. It is clear, for instance, that Augustine and his friends took it for granted that if they became committed Christians, they would also want to become monks. Thus his friend Verecundus was reluctant to become a Christian just because he was already married to a baptized believer and therefore could not be the only sort of Christian he found attractive, a monk. Evagrius Ponticus appears to have been the first monk, apart from Basil, who quickly became a bishop, to write extensively. Originating by the Black Sea, he was a preacher of note in Constantinople before abandoning his public ministry in 382 to join the monastic community in the Nitrian desert of Egypt, led by Macarius the Great. His works on monastic behavior and the ascent within the practice of prayer to contemplation were foundational for most subsequent spiritual teaching in both East and West. They represent the Hellenization of a Coptic movement, even within its homeland. John Cassian, a younger man who also came from around the Black Sea, went to Egypt soon afterwards and learnt to be a monk from Evagrius. Some 30 years later, he had moved west to found 2 monasteries near Marseille and write for them the Institutes and the Conferences, which provided the Latin world with a full introduction to both the rules and the spiritual teaching of the leading fathers of the Egyptian desert. The monastic ideology was thereby Latinized. All subsequent Western monasticism fed on Cassian, including the Rule of St. Benedict, written in central Italy, rather over a century later. Latin, as the rule, was in its balance and sobriety. Its spirit was permeated with that of the pioneers of 2 centuries before, and the bridge linking the one to the other was the writings of Cassian.